Good morning, everyone. My name's Jeff Ando. I'm Director of Content and Production at Global Trade Review, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this virtual session at the ACT Festival Treasury Transformation 2020, focused on tackling increased cyber risk and fraud from the Treasury perspective. We've got a great lineup of experts eager to share their expertise during this next hour, during which we'll look at how greater use of technology, whether the increased remote working or in improving process efficiencies, brings risks alongside the unarguable benefits, with cyber attacks having increased greatly since working from home became the norm for most. Some brief housekeeping: please submit your questions via the Q&A box just above the session window, and if you're joining us via the web link. If you're joining on the APP, the Q&A button is located at the bottom left. All questions are kept anonymous, so feel free to post whatever you like within reason, of course. This session is being recorded, and the preceding recording will be made available for rewatch on this portal shortly after the session finishes. There is a virtual discussion forum which allows you to share your comments, ideas, or takeaways about the session with speakers and fellow attendees. You can also get engaged with the ACT on its various social media channels: LinkedIn, Twitter, and all the various hashtags and details are found throughout the platform. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. My first question is for our first speaker, who's Nithai Barzam, Chief Operating Officer of nsKnox, which is a cyber fintech company focused on corporate payment security. Nithai, bringing you in, perhaps it might be a good starting point for you to give us some background on the scale and frequency of cyber attacks, as well as some of the familiar infrastructure in place for dealing with them.
Hi, everybody, and nice being with you guys, and thanks very much, Jeff, for this question. So, cyber threats around finance areas that we're interested in is a big problem globally, and it's been a big problem for a long time, and unfortunately it is escalating. Both the FBI and the SEC are constantly issuing and refreshing their reports warning about this, and I guess this is not coming as a surprise to you all, because you've probably been hit by some of those phishing emails, more sophisticated or less sophisticated. You're not alone. This may not be comforting, but over recent years, this have grown from about 60% of the organizations reporting there have been a target of an attempt to 80+% in recent years. And if you're a large company making more than 1 billion in revenues, then you're even in a worse situation, with about 90% of the companies reporting being a target, according to a 2019 AFP survey. Now, the estimates on losses vary, but in any way, in any report you're going to read, they're very substantial. The FBI, for example, have reported that in the past 3 years, from business email compromise alone, just one of the attack vectors, companies have lost $26 billion. And if you track this continuously, this problem pretty much doubles every year or 18 months. In fact, the direct losses that are reported as a result of payment fraud are actually 200 times of these reported by ransomware, which we're all so concerned about. Obviously, when it hits you, your company personally, this is very substantial. Not only the monetary losses, which are hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions, with multiple examples of companies losing tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, but also the reputational damages, dealing with audit committees, investors, and the press, not pleasant. Now, what's also interesting is the diversity of methods and techniques. We're all familiar with social engineering, with phishing, with CEO impersonation, vendor impersonation. And Jeff, typically speaking, most companies have some controls and security in place. Most of them would have standard infrastructure security along the lines of network security, endpoint security, and so on and so forth. And because of the variety of attack vectors and the scenarios, they try to implement point solutions across silos, sometimes typical anti-malware solutions, and sometimes email security is being built. But oftentimes, the main focus is really around process and training. The sad reality around this is that process is only as good as the people that follow the process. And studies are showing that people go through training, but about 30% of people that go through training actually fail. And so we've got this unfair battle where fraudsters are using state-of-the-art technology and we're using manual. And we're seeing increased complexity in attacks. It's no longer email systems only. This is now also have become use of spoofed phones and voice messages using deepfake AI, hardcore cyber attacks that are designed to steal your credentials with keyloggers, other malware and Trojans that impact our systems and try to penetrate them. And then lastly, not to forget, we unfortunately also have insiders, and they're the ones that know best. So in summary, a huge problem. It's been here for a while, and unfortunately it's growing.
Thanks, Nithai. I suppose as the premise of the session is we're now dealing in the post-COVID world. So as people are aware, the majority of people, at least in office-based jobs, are now working from home, working remotely. Some people have come back, but it's been staggered. And I believe the guidelines for many countries and organizations is still to work from home where possible. And I guess technology has enabled us to do this, but presumably that technology also provides a wider range of opportunities for cyber attacks and for fraudsters. You don't have the usual sort of firewall that you'd have in a big corporate office when someone's at home, and presumably that level of sophistication and technology is quite variable. Are we seeing greater levels of sophistication in terms of the fraudsters themselves in taking advantage of these opportunities? And how has the process or procedure side changed for those organizations looking to protect themselves?
Right. So absolutely, the crisis has a significant impact, both in terms of changes in behaviors for corporations and their employees, which obviously provides bigger opportunity for fraudsters, and we're definitely seeing an increase in fraudster activity trying to take advantage of the crisis. From a behavior standpoint, I think first we're seeing changes in behavior that are a result of the crisis. And then I'll talk a bit about the changes in behavior that are a result of the increased attack rates. So what the crisis has mandated here or caused here, as you were saying, is everybody's working from home. And so first, everything has become digital. So hardly any face-to-face meeting, nothing is pen and paper anymore. You can't jump into the boss's office anymore for another set of eyes. You just can't do these things. And so everything today is on email, text messages, phone calls, voice messages, which unfortunately provides greater opportunity for fraudsters that are now targeting communication tools, remote desktop apps, mobile phones, and spoofing and hijacking these. And we're seeing increased activity there. The second change in behavior that we're witnessing is, for most organizations, they were initially getting into sort of like a business survival mode. Let's first make sure that we can operate and then take care of the rest of things. And this obviously led to some compromises, some controls being relaxed, some centralized processes are now being decentralized. Obviously, as time goes by and companies evaluate this further, they're starting to redefine these type processes. Another change that we're seeing is with supply chain. First, lots of companies are faced with the need to change suppliers. It could be because one of your suppliers all of a sudden cannot operate anymore because of problems caused by the crisis. It could be that you have to change suppliers from international suppliers into local ones because they have difficulties shipping. And what's more than that, it made great difficulties in terms of being able to validate these suppliers, verify the companies, validate account details, because everybody's from home, you can get hold of them, which again leads for opportunity for fraudsters. I don't know about you guys, but I'm personally finding myself providing my personal details every day, a number of times. Health reports, are you okay? Did you measure your temperature, and so on and so forth. We've gotten used to that. And all of a sudden, employees are less careful about providing their information. We're seeing a lot more incidents around compromise in this area. And since we've gotten used to share this type of data, it impacts our professional thinking as well. And there are now reports that employees are 5 times more likely to click on malicious links than they were before, because everybody's trying to read more, learn more, read the news, explanation about the crisis, and so on and so forth. So in terms of maintaining, the standard finance-related processes, many customers that I speak to are trying to maintain the existing processes, but they find it's really not easy. They can't get hold of other employees or find it harder. Definitely find it much harder to get hold of vendors. Some are telling me that they've actually, stopped paying, because if they can't validate an account, they're holding the payment. And some even tell me, we're only holding payments for 60 days, so we're good. Others hold them for more. And then on the other hand, we're seeing others that are actually relaxing controls because they need to move forward. So that's pretty much it around the change and the process.
Very interesting. We mentioned we'd make this session interactive. So for those of us that are tuning in to watch us, I'd like to ask if we could have our first polling question up, please, which is, what percentage of a workforce is now working remotely? So the options are the majority, a small percentage, or about 50-50. What I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on with the next question, introduce our next speaker, and then we're going to come back to look at the results after we've addressed the next talking point. So this brings me on to our next section, which I'd like to bring in Simon Viney, Cybersecurity Financial Services Sector Lead at BAE Systems. Simon's got over 20 years of cybersecurity information risk management experience with wide-ranging expertise assisting customers in meeting various challenges, primarily in the financial services sector, but also in other areas. Simon, bringing you in here, you've worked closely with a number of organisations to help them seek to strengthen their defences, prepare for attacks, and manage the resulting impact. So I guess my question would be, in an increasingly digitised world, should cyber attacks be regarded as an accepted cost of doing business?
Yes, thanks, Jeff, and great to be here. Just in terms of that question, I wouldn't want to be too defeatist here, really, and say, we should just take cyber attacks for granted and think there's nothing we can do about them. But equally, we have to acknowledge that we're in a globally connected world, and there are threat groups, particularly criminal ones out there, that want to target companies and organisations. They're not going to go away, unfortunately. Generally, this is for direct, financial gain on the part of those criminal threat groups. I think the ransomware attacks that have targeted many, organisations recently have been in the headlines quite a lot. Obviously, Twitter news story from last night, etc. Nominally at least a scam for Bitcoin. But Nithai mentioned there's many attacks that seek to defraud payments. They're still incredibly popular. Business email compromise, etc. So we really just need to make sure that all organisations are taking steps to address those threats to protect themselves, but also the wider ecosystem they work in. Most companies are both customer and supplier to others. You don't operate in isolation effectively. Generally, to address the sort of accepted cost point, I think we just have to get better at the fundamentals of what I normally call cyber hygiene. Things like access control, patching systems in response to vulnerabilities, really quickly, being able to detect attacks against, your systems, against your employees. Those things, I guess, you could regard as an accepted cost. But in the same way that actually most organisations think reasonable physical security controls, locks on your doors, alarms, guards are, again, accepted costs for businesses. However, one of the key things really on the cyber side is actually understanding the threats you face. Again, if you think of a physical analogy, your security measures are normally tailored to the neighbourhood in which where your premises are, etc. Banks tend to have higher security than other organisations, for example, physical bank branches or vaults or whatever. So they're designed to deal with a certain threat group. In the cyber space, I think a lot of organisations, unfortunately, don't actually have necessarily a great understanding of the threats they face. And so sometimes that leads to that mismatch between the controls organisations put in place and actually ones they actually need. But ultimately, in terms of cost of doing business, you have to look at this as an overall cost equation. You want to actually make it more costly for the threat groups to do these attacks. That can be in terms of the sophistication, the effort they need to put in. these groups are out for return on investment ultimately. They want to make money. If it costs them too much effort to do it, it's not worth their while. So we have to change the balance collectively of that equation. So that's all organizations stepping up, working together. It's working with law enforcement and working across boundaries as well.
Before we move on to sort of the next part, let's maybe go back to our poll and take a look at people's responses. It does very much look like, in terms of at least this Treasury audience, the majority of people are still working remotely, even though in so many places, including here in the UK, we have seen an easing of lockdown restrictions. It definitely appears that maybe some organisations prefer having the option of people working more flexibly. I imagine there may also be some potential financial implications when it comes to maintaining offices that maybe people have realised they don't need. So that is definitely very interesting, and I guess adds further fuel to this debate in terms of making sure people have the right protection to ward against those cyber attacks, which is very interesting. We'll come back for another polling question later on in this conversation, but I guess moving on to the next point and sticking with Simon, how is the impact now measured when it comes to modelling, and how do pressure points vary? We've heard broadly about business continuity planning. It's been a big theme for this week's ACT event and the event in May as well, when things were really had only just started. Where does the issue of cybersecurity sit within this, and has there been enough stress testing going on? Simon, maybe I say back to you, and then maybe bring Nithai back as well afterwards.
Yes, a really interesting question, particularly just in this COVID situation. Unfortunately, a lot of organisations, just in my experience, still tend to treat business continuity planning and cyber instant response planning as two still separate disciplines. You have to think of it as a whole effectively. I think the organisations that have actually dealt with the COVID situation and the changes on their business most effectively are those that have really just had a good resilience culture overall. They don't necessarily think about point scenarios to how that would impact them. They will have gone through that thinking, absolutely, but they think about it more generally to say, they're almost gaming against themselves to say, what if this type of thing happens? Do they have the right culture, the management decision-making process, etc., to react to almost whatever is thrown in their direction? Those that had those sort of precursor steps in place, I think, have responded better to these scenarios. That said, though, all firms now, Nithai mentioned earlier, heavily reliant on remote access, remote conferencing technologies, things like Zoom that we're using now, and lots of other technologies. Most, as the poll showed, most people still working remotely. Generally, companies, have vast numbers of staff working in that manner that they didn't have before. So they won't necessarily be using corporate IT to initiate that connection, etc. But actually, if you have staff using remote access, that was probably your previous fallback position in your business continuity plan. But that's now the new normal, as the expression goes. So if you now get an issue with your remote access solution, what's your fallback to that? How do you make sure that your staff can still do some level of business if you suddenly had an outage in your remote access systems? Just say you were targeted by a denial of service attack or something else. How would you still make sure that you stay resilient overall? One, I guess, interesting point in the financial services industry, particularly driven by the UK regulators recently, there's been a lot of focus on what they term operational resilience. That's really looking at it and saying, what are the key services you provide out to your customers, to the market? Again, going back to the point I mentioned earlier, organizations don't operate in a bubble. You don't work in isolation. There are what they term important business services that actually lots of people rely on. Obvious cases, online banking, payment systems, etc. But there are many more. How do you make sure that you still provide what I'd probably term the minimum viable service that people need in a wide range of severe but plausible scenarios? And COVID type situation could be one of those. Denial of service attack against your organization could be one of those. How do you make sure you still keep that minimum viable service going? So there's been a lot of thinking in the, I said, financial service industry around that space to say, collectively, how do you do that? Because it's not working in isolation. You can't just take a decision as a company and say, this is what we're doing. You need to know what your customers expect, how they react, how they expect you to be working with them.
Nithai, would you perhaps like to come in here as well with your views on this?
Yeah, sure. First, to spend a second on the point that some organizations are better suited to address this type of crisis than others. If you're in technology and most of your employees are working on cloud-based environments and using laptops already, and you've got corporate equipment provided to all employees, and remote working is in your culture, and it was just a matter of expanding this, and now we have to do that. We don't just, it's not that we can do it, but we have to do it. And companies like nsKnox, no problem. Development can continue onwards remotely. The developers are happy about this. We can continue to speak to customers across Zoom and so on and so forth. For some organizations, this was a much bigger change. The employees don't have laptops. They start using their own home computers, or you scramble to quickly purchase new equipment and ship it over, and sometimes without even testing that the firmware is okay and that they're secured and so on and so forth, which really introduced a lot of challenges and problems from a security standpoint. And so I think for some organizations, the term business continuity really meant, how do I actually operate the business? How do I actually access my finance systems to onboard a supplier and update my ERP system? How do I pay vendors and so on and so forth? And we'll worry about security a bit later. And they're now catching up for sure, both in terms of infrastructure security, in terms of process, as well as some specialized technology to address these type things.
So is it your view very much that, I suppose, the panic that so many organizations felt in, let's say, March, a lot of them are now playing catch up when mistakes have been made, maybe not the necessary due diligence has been paid when setting up that remote working across maybe many hundreds and thousands of staff, and there's a certain amount of sort of running things back to readdress those problems now going on?
Yep, I think definitely. Yep, the initial weeks around the March into April timeframe were really sort of like disaster mode type thing. Let's make sure we can operate. And after that, we're starting. I hate to use the term, but this is the new normal, and it's with us, and we need to be addressing this at all levels. So yes, definitely starting to catch up.
I think the phrases new normal and social distancing are very much into the lexicon for 2020. We've also got Andy Bates here, who's the Executive Director for the UK, Middle East and India at the Global Cyber Alliance, which is an international cross-sector non-profit dedicated to eradicating cyber risk, which seems a very lofty goal. Andy, you yourself have got extensive experience in working with governments to provide cyber solutions. One area we've heard a lot about is the importance of collaboration, of the need for corporates to look to partner with technology providers to provide and share expertise. What's your view with regards to best practice on sharing information? And is there a cybersecurity playbook, as it were, to help companies when faced with cyber attacks?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you all today. I suppose if I answer the two questions in reverse, if I may. In terms of the playbook, I think Simon covered the point quite well earlier, that many companies have got disaster recovery strategies. You have fire drills, you do all of these training around physical assets, but people very rarely do that around cyber. In fact, when you hit a cyber attack, or a cyber attack hits you, that's probably everybody's first exposure to what to do. So to say there is one playbook that would work for every organization just wouldn't work, because every organization is different. But there are certainly some key themes in those. I think my big recommendation would be try and drill these things, try and simulate them before you get into that emergency situation. So organizations like the Cyber Rescue Alliance are quite good at boardroom simulations. And I think the TalkTalk attack, for those who remember that, of nearly 2 years ago now, just how you handle the press, how you handle your board, the stakeholders and the shareholders, all of that is in some ways as important as the technological response. The Twitter hack, which has happened overnight that we've already referenced, from what we've seen so far, appears to have not been a technological attack. It was simply, what's the word I'm looking for, committing fraud on insiders who had the controls of the keys to then allow the attack to take forward. So I think insider attack is a big thing these days. So it isn't just a technological solution, it's a personal solution, if you like. And there's a book out there which I think is still free called Whaling for Beginners. So I think if you could all download that from Amazon, it gives you the emotional connection. It's a novel that talks you through a cyber attack, but it gives you that feeling of, oh dear, it's all gone horribly wrong. And I think unlike fire and bombs and all the other things which people have a drill for, cyber doesn't have an emotional connection with the individual. So I think once you go through that drill and that exercise and realize that you're the man or woman on point, it gets you connected with the subject. And back to the first half of the question, information sharing. So yes, technology providers can help, and they are sharing information together. We found, being an international NGO, that people's desire to share data with us is quite high, and that's encouraging. In fact, we found during COVID, more people are willing to share. We've seen the statistics. One of our platforms was blocking 60 million cyber events daily. During COVID, it went up to 100 million, and it's still at that level. So I think in emergency war footing situations, people are more likely to share than they were before. My kind of closing 2 points are, there's an organization called the Cyber Defence Alliance based in London. It's the big high street banks, Lloyds, HSBC, etc. They all share intel because they know if one of them is attacked on the Monday, that the other would be attacked on the Tuesday. So they are a shining example of competitors actually making cyber not a competitive advantage and sharing together in that space. We're still currently building platforms in this space to also help. But I think my closing point to the questions would be, organizations like ACT are a brilliant place to allow you to all share best practice. Everybody who's a member of ACT or on this call today, some of you will have done something in this space, but the concept of sharing it with your colleagues or your competitors is unusual. If the CDA and the big banks can do that, then I think all of you can. And I think ACT provides an environment where you can share safely, knowing that the people you're sharing with are in the same situation and part of a trusted community.
Yeah, I guess as will be witnessed by the various consortia in initiatives like blockchain, I suppose the idea of competitors collaborating is certainly more common than it was. Would anyone else like to come in on this point around collaboration?
Yeah, no, I just, Jeff, just from my experience, Andy described it quite well. Unfortunately, the threat groups, the attackers, they work together. They make money off each other, but they work in collaboration. They share between themselves because they know that actually if they work together, it's for both of their benefits. On the more defensive side, we still don't frequently enough take that view, and we need collectively to think, how do we collectively defend ourselves? I made the point earlier, we can't think in isolation. It's not just about defending our organization, our company. It's about defending our supply chain of the customers who rely on us. So we have to take that wider view.
I think if I can build on Simon's point, and often with a physical audience, I ask, hands up anybody who knows how many hackers there are in the world, and the numbers go all over the place. And the big point is to say greater than one. So if you work individually, because as Simon points out, we do know that the criminals have international supply chains. They're not constrained by GDPR and national regulation. They can do what they like to make criminal money and criminal gain. So they all do work together. So if we don't work together, it's always going to be greater than yourself. Therefore, invariably something bad would happen. So yes, collaboration mathematically is the answer as well as morally.
This next question actually is collaboration, but more at an internal level. Looking at the different structures within organizations, the question is, how much of a challenge can it be of understanding who owns the problem when it comes to cyber and how different functions need to work together? Are fraudsters looking to capitalize on any silos found within organizational structures? We actually had a question just submitted through the question system saying, why is this something that Treasury should care about? Is this not an IT issue? So I guess that very much speaks to this. Bringing Nithai back here, what are your views on this? I think you've got some interesting things to say.
So I think this is an excellent question. And the fact that, we had somebody in the crowd from Treasury ask, why is this a Treasury problem and not an IT issue is really amazing to me, because I often hear, the other thing, why should I care of this? I'm the information security guy, and this is money we're talking about, and this is process we're talking about. And this is where I think the fundamental issue is, and it's this huge gap that fraudsters are definitely taking advantage of. They will seek any type crack to sleep through and take our money. So the problem we're talking about essentially sits between, you know, procurement and finance on one side, and maybe IT and information security on the other side. And on one hand, you've got a group of people that are absolutely familiar with the business process, with how you onboard new suppliers and update their details, with how you affect payments, how you validate, how you control all this. But they're not really familiar with, you know, the cyber threats and the technology. And on the other hand, you've got technical people that are really familiar with cyber attacks, with threats, and so on and so forth, but they're definitely not experts around the business process, and they will not always know, you know, how approvals are generated, how many phone calls are you making to validate details, and so on and so forth. And given that the posture today that fraudsters have, and to sort of like follow up on the previous question, they collaborate like hell. And if somebody thinks that a fraudster is like this hooded guy sitting in the basement, you know, it's a big mistake. This is a well-organized organization, great funding. Just imagine if you stole $100 million out of Google and Facebook, how much money you have to invest in tools to make, you know, the next one. And so what we're actually seeing today is that technology bypasses, the fraudsters are able to bypass the manual controls that our procurement and finance teams are making. So if somebody now has access into your vendor's email system, they can learn your communications, they will send you emails that will look really legitimate, they will be coming from a legitimate email address, and it will be hard for you as a finance person to defend. If somebody actually penetrates your network and now knows where your ERP server is and is able to intercept your payment file before it goes to the clearinghouse, and they can manipulate this, it doesn't really matter what process you had or how many phone calls you made to validate the details, you're gonna pay a fraudulent account. And so in my view, only by working really close together, both these teams, and owning this problem, will they be able to actually successfully try and defend. In my view, I think IT and information security should do more to own this problem. But given the constraints that they have from a manpower standpoint, from a budget standpoint, they typically focus on, you know, the general cybersecurity, endpoint security, network security, and so on and so forth. And rarely will they focus on providing specific technological solution to secure the business process, and in this case, you know, the payment process.
Great. I think we're going to go to our second polling question. That seems like a good time to go into that, which is how familiar are you with your company's cyber strategy? And the options are well versed in it, broadly familiar, or I'm not aware of it. I think what we'll do is we'll probably lead people to, some may have only just seen that. To cast a few more votes. Bringing Andy back in here, what are the big trends that you've noted when it comes to cybercrime and the activities of fraudsters? And how is this likely to change the landscape for cyber risk prevention?
Yeah, if I can build on the previous point about why is this relevant for treasurers rather than IT, just very quickly. We did some research with EACT a couple of years ago and many other organizations. And we found out that 90% of most industries, it's possible for me to send an email actually using your email without hacking into your system. And that's nothing to do with your IT department, it's to do with the other guys who are sending you that email. So imagine if today you got an email from somebody who you know and trust, and it was exactly their email domain, but it's come from me, not from them. Just think how differently you behave at work. And that's nothing to do with your own IT department. So I think if that's one fact I give you today to answer that previous question, hopefully that's helpful. Back to the actual question, what are the big trends we've noticed? I mentioned earlier one platform that we built for free, went from 60 million attacks to 100 just during COVID. We thought we were clever finding 20,000 COVID designed domains on a Monday at the start of the crisis. We found it was actually 60,000 a day after. The total number at last count was 2.5 million. So there are certainly more people capitalizing from COVID. Everybody's granny is now doing online yoga, and everybody's granny is now doing online banking, which they didn't used to do. So physical bricks and mortar banks are not the answer now. So there's a whole new dimension there. But the big thing I mean, two things in terms of big economic trends. The cyber defense market is growing at a 13% CAGR, but the total cost of cybercrime and fraud, I think, is approximately 2 trillion at a 20% CAGR. That's just going to accelerate even more because of the online world. But a big bit of research we discovered last year was that many criminals are moving down the stack. And by this, I mean, rather than just stealing 10 million from someone, and that is continuing, but it's easier to steal 10 million by taking £100 off 100,000 people every month or every day or in every action than it is to go after one big audacious 10 million smash and grab operation. Why? I mean, as all of you will know on the call better than I will do, having 10 million and disposing of it apparently is a problem. Whereas dealing with lots of little £100 transactions across 100 different law enforcement jurisdictions is hard to find, but it's easy to dispose of that money. So in that action, many criminals are now moving to SMEs. So I think one of the other panelists mentioned earlier about the supply chain. Supply chain can't afford millions of pounds and dollars worth of cybersecurity defense. That's why organizations like us exist to produce free solutions. But we're seeing attacks on the SME markets increasing, and as I say, the size of an average attack is going down simply to avoid detection, but also to make it easier to move money around the system.
Great. Just going back to the polling, I think there might have been a slight technical issue. Hopefully everyone was able to grasp where the polls were and to vote. I'm just going to look at the results so far. So the options were how familiar are you with your company's cyber strategy? The options were well versed in it, broadly familiar, I'm not aware. It seems like very few people are not aware at all, which is great. But more people are broadly familiar than well versed. Does anyone have any views on that? Is that surprising or not? I mean, as a layman on this issue, that doesn't surprise me massively, because I guess it's something people are starting to learn about from a low base. But does anyone have any thoughts?
I guess the 15% is always concerning. It goes back to that question of why would the Treasurer be worried about an IT or cyber strategy? But I think the question could be, are you aware of what your role in that is slightly different? But yeah, 15% being in double digits, I think is surprising to me. I would have hoped that would have been slightly lower.
Yeah, just from my perspective, I'd actually also spin that around, and it'd be an interesting question as to how many information security teams or cyber teams are aware of what their, the payment strategy is, for example, or something else. Is a transformation going on in that space that the cyber security function's not sighted of? So, this sort of two-way communication, it has to be two-way communication.
Yeah, I think Simon nailed it, on the head. I'm happy that lots of people are familiar with, the cyber strategy, but the question I think becomes is, what is the cyber strategy missing in terms of protecting your specific business? And it's exactly the way you said it, how many of the cyber people will actually be familiar with the business process that's going on for finance, which is extremely complex.
Great. Well, we've got quite a few questions coming in from the audience, so we'll get into those. Just to follow on with a couple more from the initial chat that we've lined up here. When it comes to reputational risk, is there a sector divide when it comes to cyber? Certain companies for which cyber attacks are more damaging. People would think of the big attack on Maersk not that long ago, and maybe they would perhaps get away with it, to use a phrase, better than if, say, Google was attacked. Are we looking at a level playing field with no companies having an excuse, or is it more damaging reputationally for some types of companies than others, bearing in mind we've got this increased technological element to pretty much all nature of business these days?
I can try and take it. So from a fraudster standpoint, there's no difference. They will steal your money, they will penetrate your system, and they will interfere with your business regardless of industry you're at. So in this respect, everybody should be concerned. In terms of, the damages themselves, then monetary losses is easy to understand for everybody. When we talk about reputational damage, then maybe it starts to vary, right? If you're a financial services organization, then somebody stole lots of money from you, and your customers start to think, do I trust this organization to keep my money? probably not as much. And the same would apply, right? If you're a technology provider that's supposed to be providing secured storage and you were hacked, then I'm not going to trust you. So I think it's a bit of both. First, yes, there may be reputational damages differences between organizations, but I don't think any organization in any industry today can say, I'm pretty good, let's just take it as it is. We need to do something about this collectively.
And as a second question to that, maybe one for you, Simon, and I'm aware that you've got a background in working with financial service providers. The responsibility of banks and other financiers in terms of cyber savviness, questions of client bankability. There's been a huge drive in the financial services market to move towards digitization, and companies have had hopefully not, maybe not quite pressure, but they've been encouraged, shall we say, to digitize their activities. Is there a risk here, bearing in mind perhaps not all companies are quite ready for the same levels of digitization as some of the larger ones? And does this mean that certain banks and financial FIs have a responsibility to make sure they give the right guidance?
Yes, yeah, great question. I mean, in terms of the underlying risk, people often sort of think, oh, where we were non-digital, we were safer. Actually, the risk was always there. It was just, you generally couldn't do it so remotely. But people could still, there were still weaknesses within those processes, procedures as to how, fraudulent transactions or something could be put in. The challenge is when you move to the digital world, quite often you've then exposed that ability to everybody globally, potentially, and making sure that, as I said, those hygiene factors are there. Yes, actually, banks, big technology providers, I think, have a responsibility there. You often hear the sort of phrase secure by design. It has to, we have to default to giving people what we think are the secure choices. Yes, you might always give people options to, customize those for when they really understand what they're doing. But, think of, again, physical analogies. You don't tend to buy, I don't know, a car these days and think, do I need to add to the security of it? You expect it to have the right measures in place to prevent theft. It's those sort of things, and we have to, start to build that way of thinking into the technology space as well. I think the banks, yes, they do a lot to detect fraudulent transactions and anomalous, transactions. I think there's potentially always more that people can do there, but organisations themselves have to, make sure they're also looking at that. Are they taking the right measures to, make sure they have the right process in place that somebody can't just initiate and approve a transaction, nobody else gets notified in the company, etc.
Nithai, Andy, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
No, you, please.
Oh, okay. So I think there's, responsibility and accountability. I've had some interesting discussions, with banks on this. So do they need to do more, and can they do more, and are they doing a lot? That definitely, it's our collective desire to reduce fraud and to fight criminals and so on and so forth. In terms of, being accountable for this is a big question. If you're providing your bank with instructions to transfer money from your account to another, and it turns out it's fraudulent, then yeah, I wish they would have caught this, but it becomes, you're accountable for that, and they will not always compensate you for it. And then another, thought around this, as we push for faster payments and real-time payments and so on and so forth. I've heard, I think it was in one of your previous conferences, one of the ACT conferences, and I forget the name of the speaker, but the lady was saying something along the lines of faster payments means faster fraud. And, so I think with this comes great responsibility as well.
And all I'd quickly add to that, if I can, is, think what do cyber criminals do with the money? They don't just buy Aston Martins and Lamborghinis. It goes into international terrorism. It funds the international slave trade, body organs, and a whole load of things you can buy on the dark web, from cruise missiles to crystal meth. All of that is the same criminal organization. So is there a responsibility? I think absolutely. That 2 trillion I talked about earlier, the criminals don't do good things with that money. So let your mind run crazy about where that money goes. And I think that answers the financial responsibility question quite easily.
I think in terms of the financial responsibility and the fact that we are talking ultimately about people losing money here, one area that we should probably touch on is that of insurance. In your experiences, are insurance companies willing to pay out on cyber? What sorts of limits are being set, and how has the bar for this changed in recent times? I'm not sure what experience that any of you have in terms of dealing with insurance companies or working with clients who have had to, but what's your view on that? And also as a follow-up, I suppose, presumably insurers themselves aren't immune to attacks, so does that bring into question the issue of a wider ecosystem for managing those risks?
So all I'll add to that is to say that of the insurance companies I've come across, yes, you can insure for anything, as we all know, and the premiums depend on your risk profile. I think if there's one thing, back to the earlier point about simulation and thinking about your strategy and how things go wrong, bringing in an insurance company, and clearly this is a big policy, means people will look at your risk, will help you to do that thinking that you need to do before you have an attack. And then clearly you get a lower premium the more cyber hygiene you introduce into your organization and into your supply chain. So yeah, I think it creates the right kind of behavior. I don't have a lot of experience on how people have paid out, but certainly we have seen payments in the insurance industry. But as ever, it's imagine if your office burnt down every 6 months, imagine what your premium would be like. So the cyber insurance market is not as mature as the established markets, but it's getting there. And it is I think it's a useful vehicle in terms of informing your own company and driving that premium debate, as opposed to just having it as an emergency thing that you reach to once you've been hacked.
Yeah, Jeff, just adding to what Andy was saying there, in my experience, the insurers will pay out where it fits within obviously the terms of the policy and the scope of the policy. And actually that's one of the key things. I think organizations quite often don't fully understand the scope of what they're buying. They perhaps think they're buying, a cyber attack cover, but actually cyber attack cover, that doesn't really exist. There's a multiple ways that companies get attacked in a cyber context. But if it's, if you're losing money on unauthorized payments, that's probably more of a general sort of crime type policy. If you're talking, denial of service, that's a different type of attack. If you're talking loss of personal data, again, different. So it's making sure as an organization, you really think, what scenarios do we want to insure against? Does our insurance give us that cover? And look at your insurance policies in the round. I know, one interesting exercise that BAE does is, obviously a big sort of FTSE 100 company. We look at our insurance cover in the round and effectively almost sort of test it to say, if this event happens, does our insurance give us the right coverage? To make sure that across the multiple policies, we can go, right, if it was that type of scenario, it would trigger this part of that policy. If it was this, it would trigger over there. Do we actually end up with the complete picture? And I think a lot of companies, unfortunately, don't go through that.
And I think,
sorry, carry on.
Sorry, Jeff, I was going to say, just to tell that out, I think I'd also be careful of the act of war clause. I think it's public knowledge that Maersk were an unfortunate bystander in an action between Russia and Ukraine. So I think in a nation state attack, does the act of war clause mean that that attack doesn't pay out? So I think that would be one to watch out for, certainly.
And maybe a quick follow-up there. Yes, we've seen, insurance policy that are, sometimes really specific, even as far as saying, business email compromise and social engineering. However, I'm seeing, typically they're really expensive, and the amounts they cover would be, up to 100K or something like this. And you could buy more, and then it becomes more expensive. And I think overall, as an approach, other than everything that was said about evaluating your insurance and so on and so forth, it really is, for me, about avoiding the issue altogether, right? We all insure our houses, but we still make sure we lock the door and put an alarm there to avoid the incident altogether. So let's not try to, forget to do this with cyber threats in general.
Yeah, I guess we don't have any insurers here. If any are out there, it'd be really interesting at some point to find out what the issue is in terms of policies evolving and I suppose the reinsurance side of how insurers handle it themselves when the risk being attacked. We've got a few more questions submitted through the system, so thanks to everyone for getting in contact. I'll run through a few more of these. First one, how much impact has two-factor authentication had on reducing cyber fraud? I don't know if anyone wants to take that.
One word answer, I think, would be massive, or it's certainly definitely the way to go.
Yeah.
Anyone want to follow up?
Without naming names, I'll say, some email systems, if you don't use the two-factor authentication, how should we put it, are extremely easy to penetrate. And given so many bad things happen, we'll start with emails, and then it becomes malware, and it becomes compromise, and it becomes everything else that's critical. So I'll second that. It's critical. Yeah,
no, I mean, just from my perspective, as Andy said, a massive impact. The one thing I would note is we're dealing with an intelligent, threat adversary here. So two-factor authentication by itself doesn't mean they're going to stop trying to get to the money or to what their objective was. In a lot of cases, actually, people initially sort of thought, oh, we'll do two-factor authentication via, particularly some of the banks, via sending a text message to your mobile phone. But hold on, so you've suddenly put reliance on the telephone companies to make sure they're now managing who has access to that phone correctly. Are you sure that process is robust? So sometimes you can just inadvertently shift the problem. As I said, the threat groups, they still have their motivation. They will still think, can they find weakness somewhere else? So don't necessarily think anything is a panacea.
Our next question here, we're just going to get through this fairly quick fire, I think, to see us get through as many as we can. E-commerce has exploded in the post-COVID world, or the current COVID world, I suppose you'd say, and there are many players involved in the payment flows. Which are the best tools to secure this segment?
I think, wow, this is a really broad question, and it's got, multiple layers to it. When we speak about e-commerce, there's, the side of between the consumer that purchases and the online store. And there's a variety of discussions around consumer fraud and all sorts of stuff, multiple tools. I would not be the expert on these type tools. On the other hand, it also presents some interesting challenges around what we call B2B payments, because, this online stores goes ahead and buys and is the storefront for other merchants and so on and so forth. So it becomes, your typical Treasury/finance/ B2B payment security question. I'm obviously going to vote for the solution that we provide in this area, but I don't think necessarily this was the intent of the question. So
yeah, there's a separate one about which security software is best to use. So I suppose that's a similar sort of thing, very much a personal choice based on your organization and lots of variables there. Thinking of end users, this is the next question. Thinking of end users in your respective organizations, how important is it to give refreshers on technology best practices? I suppose never more important than in the current climate. Does anyone have any views on that question?
So I jump in and say, I think it's important, but back to the point about insider attack and the Twitter hack that happened last night, I think going through scenarios of how people can be tricked, so almost getting into the criminal mindset around what could go wrong is probably more important. So I'm fortunate enough to be related to two people with PhDs in criminology, but I think thinking what the bad guys could do to your systems, and actually you can make this fun with your teams and your staff. Away days aren't really going to happen in the current circumstances, but gaming out what could go wrong, how people could spoof you. So the fact I gave you today, which is 90% of emails can be impersonated without hacking into a system. Just try that fact with your team and say, imagine if I got an email asking to move a payment and it was a fraudulent email, what would I do? I think that would be where I'd put the emphasis. But in answer to the actual question, yes, as important. And I think the important point is to get engagement. So many people do annual training on GDPR and cyber, and people go through some questions. They're not really paying attention, making a coffee, not really emotionally engaged. I think I get back to that point about this is it's a dry subject to get emotionally engaged too. But trust me, I've been on the receiving attack of a nation state attack. Once you are engaged, you wish you would have been a lot more engaged a lot earlier. So it's back to that simulation and drills, I think, are super important.
Next question here. Are there security forums for corporate users like the Cyber Defense Alliance mentioned? So something that might be more relevant to our predominantly corporate treasurer audience that are tuning in now.
So there's the FSISAC and the FSCCC in the UK, but I think my suggestion out to this would be maybe the ACT, or maybe all of us can help to bring some value, further value to the ACT membership to pull those together. But yeah, there are numerous different ISACs for various industries around the world, but maybe Simon and Nithai can build on that.
Yes, I mean, Andy mentioned, the various sort of ISAC type organisations. There's a lot of those by industry type, retail, FS, etc. In the UK, the National Cyber Security Centre, they run a set of information security sharing forums for organisations in various industry sectors. So there are mechanisms out there that corporates have access to, and actually it could well be that you'll find someone in your organisation is already part of that. Again, it goes back to that silo point. It could well be someone in your cyber team who's part of that, but the sharing doesn't happen more generally than across your organisation.
Great. Well, this next question, I think this will be the last one we go from the audience. And thank you again to everyone. A slightly, maybe a slightly glass half empty question. Should we all be assuming we will be attacked rather than hoping we will not be? Is it inevitable?
Yes.
Well, I'll say hope is not a strategy, and it's better to assume you will be attacked and then think what you would do in that event, and then hope is a strategy and hope that you don't be. But yeah, certainly just hoping and not this. If the assumption drives the right kind of behaviour, then I think that's a good assumption.
Yeah. Okay. So just as I guess final comments from all of you, Simon, from your side, I guess one really interesting area is the fact that the last few months could in many ways be seen as a big sort of uncontrolled experiment. And I know that you provide advisory to various organisations in terms of cyber, and with everyone having to transition to remote working in one go. In your role, are there any anecdotes or stories you'd like to share on this in terms of lessons you feel have been learned?
Yes, I mean, as you say, it's been a really interesting experiment. But I think those companies that were already progressing in terms of a digital transformation, they had that agility in place to suddenly take perhaps hundreds of users who were working remotely to then be able to say, actually, thousands, are now working remotely. Those are the ones that were, better placed and can build on, the foundations they've put in place. One of the challenges, though, and it comes an interesting sort of security risk decision. Lots of companies build in effectively physical processes for good reason, for segregation reasons, that work in an office type environment. How do you now say, okay, we used to perhaps have to make sure that different systems had to authorize it, people sat in different locations, for segregation of duties type reasons to do that. Now suddenly people are working remotely. How are you sure that still, you still have equivalent controls in place, particularly where you don't get that physical separation that you used to rely on? I know one organization that effectively had to freeze its payment monitoring solution because it could only be accessed from the office. And so staff working remotely couldn't take action if any anomalous payments were flagged. So they effectively just had to temporarily freeze it because they didn't have the flexibility built into it.
And a final question for you, Nithai. What solutions would you like to offer and propose for the coming months and beyond in this new normal, as we like to say, that we're all facing?
Yeah, so first I think it's the acknowledgement that it is a new normal and it's going to stay for a while. So we really need to sort of like embrace it and act accordingly, then ignore this, which is sort of like following up on your previous question. Yes, you should assume that you will be a target. You're much more likely to be than not. I think this being a complex problem probably requires a multi-layered solution, and so it should start with the infrastructure security in place. Make sure you sit down with your IT and information security teams and talk about things just like we talked about before. Align these controls with your process. The second layer would be your processes. We talked about training. We typically talk about multiple points in there, so definitely make sure that your process actually aligns with what's happening now with everybody working from home and so on and so forth. And then thirdly, some specialized tools that will provide the flexibility of these choke points around validating your inputs and validating your outputs, monitoring your payments, and do all this when you are remote.
And I guess thank you, Nithai. Andy, as a final point, maybe you could offer some future predictions. Where do you see the conversation heading here in this unprecedented time that we're all living in?
Yeah, good question, and searching for a big finish. I think so. The physical security industry has probably been destroyed by COVID-19. So I think let's take all the money that we used to spend on physical security, and in some cases offices, and if that gives us the time and resource to focus on IT security, that's got to be a good thing. I think the locks and doors conversation has probably been a distraction for our industry, and I think I'm no expert in macroeconomics, but I mentioned earlier that 2 trillion is being lost to online crime. And I think the total estimated costs of the COVID recession are going to be around 10 trillion. So I guess if we could completely eradicate online crime, which will never happen, we'd pay for COVID in 5 years, which is a pretty good ROI. So I think back to the point we've all said about cyber hygiene, and is this a relevant thing for treasurers as opposed to the IT department? Yeah, I mean, just getting that money back into the system is the equivalent of all of Canada's GDP being stolen every single year. Just think if we could take some of that and throw it back into the rightful economy, it's got to be good for the treasury system. So I think that's where I'd like to see world leaders thinking that there's a source of funding for the world that actually is stopping cybercrime. So maybe I'm a hopeless optimist, but it's not a bad thought to drive us forward, I think.
No, I think that definitely constitutes a big finish. So thank you. Well, I think that brings this session to a close. Many thanks to our speakers and to our audience for participating, putting in their questions on this hugely interesting topic. If I could ask those watching to fill in the feedback survey. Feedback access can be found next to the Q&A button on your screen. You can also continue the discussion at the virtual discussion forum. Please stay tuned for this final day of the ACT Festival of Treasury Transformation 2020. There's a full lineup of fascinating sessions and insightful speakers following on. The various sessions from this week are already up on the platform to view on demand, and this session will be soon as well. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us, and do take care.